Lord Peter Wimsey was reflecting upon the curious inability of the Great Western Railway to maintain a first-class compartment at any temperature between Arctic and equatorial, when the train came to one of those sudden, grinding halts that suggest either signal failure or the intervention of divine providence in the affairs of men. "Bunter," he observed, steadying his cigarette case as the carriage lurched to a standstill, "I have always maintained that railway travel combines the worst aspects of being buried alive with the additional inconvenience of motion. Now it appears we are to enjoy the burial without the motion, which strikes me as distinctly unsporting." "Indeed, my lord," replied Bunter, who was methodically securing the contents of a small traveling case with the precision of a man who has learned that sudden stops in expensive crockery are natural enemies. "Though I venture to suggest that the cessation of motion may prove temporary." They had boarded the 9:35 from Paddington some 40 minutes previously, bound for Little Chiding in Dorset, where Wimsey was expected for a weekend of rural tedium involving his godfather, the Bishop of Melchester, and what promised to be an excruciating discussion of medieval church architecture. The compartment they occupied was respectably appointed, but bore that particular railway atmosphere of stale tobacco, leather polish, and the accumulated anxieties of commercial travelers. "Signal failure, one supposes," Wimsey continued, and peering through the rain-streaked window into the November darkness. "Though the timing is rather theatrical. We appear to have stopped in the middle of absolutely nowhere, which is precisely where one expects the most interesting things to happen in detective stories. Life, unfortunately, rarely obliges with such convenient dramatics. It was at this moment that life chose to prove Lord Peter spectacularly wrong. From the corridor came a sound that no railway timetable could adequately explain. A woman's scream, sharp and brief, followed by the distinctive thud of a body striking the floor. Then silence, save for the settling creaks of the stationary train and the drumming of rain against the windows. Wimsey was on his feet with that deceptive languor that masked considerable athletic ability. "That, Bunter, was decidedly more interesting than signal failure, though I do hope it doesn't involve anything too sordid. I'm wearing my good evening clothes, and bloodstains are so difficult to explain to one's tailor." The corridor of their carriage was dimly lit by gas mantles that hissed softly in their brackets. At the far end, near the door to the next carriage, a young woman in a traveling coat stood pressed against the wall, her face the color of parchment. She was staring with fixed horror at the open door of compartment C. "I say," Wimsey murmured, approaching with the careful tread of a man who has learned that sudden movements around frightened witnesses tend to produce hysteria. "Are you quite all right? You look as though you've seen something rather disagreeable." The woman turned toward him with the mechanical movement of someone in shock. She was perhaps 25, respectably dressed, with dark hair escaping from a small hat and intelligent eyes that were currently wide with terror. "There's a man," she whispered. "In there. He's not moving. And there's blood." Wimsey glanced into compartment C and immediately understood her distress. The compartment contained a single passenger, a middle-aged gentleman in an expensive overcoat, slumped in the corner seat with his head at an angle that suggested his neck had been broken with considerable efficiency. A small pool of blood had formed beneath his head, soaking into the plush upholstery with the grim persistence of evidence. "Bunter," Wimsey called softly, "kindly ensure that no one else enters this carriage. And perhaps you might check whether the guard is available. We appear to have acquired a corpse, which will undoubtedly complicate our travel arrangements." He turned back to the young woman, who was now gripping the corridor rail with white knuckles. "I'm Lord Peter Wimsey. Might I ask your name and what precisely you saw?" "Miss Felicity Dane," she managed. I was returning from the lavatory when the train stopped. I heard a sound from that compartment, like furniture being overturned. Then silence. The door was ajar, so I looked in and..." She gestured helplessly toward the body. Quite understandable, Whimsy said gently. And you saw no one leaving the compartment? No one in the corridor? No one. But that's impossible, isn't it? I mean, he can't have killed himself. Not like that. Whimsy stepped carefully into the compartment, his pale eyes taking in every detail with the methodical attention of a man who has made a study of violent death. The deceased was well-dressed, perhaps 50 years old, with the soft hands of a man unaccustomed to manual labor. His wallet lay on the seat beside him, apparently untouched. On the floor near his feet lay a railway timetable and what appeared to be a telegram, its yellow paper stark against the dark carpet. "Bunter," he called, "have you located the guard?" "He appears to be in the next carriage, my lord, dealing with what he describes as difficulties with the signals." "Shall I fetch him?" "In a moment. First, I should like to know who else is traveling in this carriage." Whimsy's voice had taken on that particular tone of polite inquiry that those who knew him had learned to fear. "Miss Dane, you mentioned returning from the lavatory. Which compartment are you occupying?" "Compartment A, my lord. I'm traveling alone." "And the other compartments?" "I believe there's a clergyman in B. I saw his collar when he boarded at Reading. Compartment D appears to be empty, and I haven't seen anyone from E or F." Whimsy nodded thoughtfully. "So we have yourself, a clergyman, a dead gentleman, Bunter and myself, and possibly 1 or 2 other passengers, all sealed into a single railway carriage that has been stationary for—" He consulted his pocket watch. "Precisely 7 minutes. The doors between carriages are locked according to night protocol. The train is stopped in open countryside, and our deceased friend has been murdered in a manner that suggests considerable physical strength." He bent to examine the telegram on the floor, careful not to disturb its position. The message was brief. "Arrangements confirmed. Meet as discussed. Urgent. MS." "Most illuminating," Whimsy murmured. "Though I suspect Mr. MS will find that the arrangements have been somewhat disrupted. Bunter, I think we had better have that guard now, and perhaps you might ask the clergyman to join us. In my experience, the clergy are remarkably useful in situations involving sudden death. They're accustomed to the inconvenient habits of mortality." As Bunter departed on his mission, Whimsy remained in the corridor, his elegant figure motionless as he contemplated the locked carriage puzzle before him. Outside, the rain continued its assault on the windows, and somewhere in the darkness, signal lamps blinked their cryptic messages to an empty landscape. "Miss Dane," he said finally, "I'm afraid we're going to be here rather longer than the railway timetable suggests. We appear to have stumbled into one of those tiresome situations where someone has committed murder in an impossible place at an inconvenient time. The police will want to speak with all of us, and I suspect they'll be rather thorough about it." He lit a cigarette with steady hands, the flame briefly illuminating his sharp, aristocratic features. "In the meantime, I suggest we try to determine exactly who was supposed to be on this train tonight, and more importantly, who wasn't." The 9:35 from Paddington sat motionless in the November darkness, its lighted windows glowing like a chain of amber beads against the night. Inside, a dead man kept his final appointment, and somewhere among the surviving passengers, a murderer waited for the morning. The guard arrived with the harried expression of a man whose evening had been personally affronted by inconvenience. Guard Perkins, as he introduced himself, possessed the sort of bristling moustache that seemed to bear the accumulated grievances of the entire Great Western Railway system. "This is highly irregular, my lord," he announced, staring at the corpse with the injured air of a man whose timetables were being deliberately sabotaged. "We've been stopped for signal failure at Westbury Junction 10 minutes now. Can't move the train with a body aboard. Not without proper authorization." "How refreshingly bureaucratic," Whimsy observed. "Death may be the great leveler, but it still requires the appropriate forms. Tell me, Perkins, you checked tickets after reading?" "That I did, my lord. Standard procedure." He consulted a worn notebook with the reverence of a man handling Holy Scripture. Compartment A, young lady to Dorchester. That's Miss Dane here. Compartment B, clergyman bound for little chiding. Compartment C, the deceased gentleman, first-class single to Westbury. Your compartment, my lord, and compartments D through F were empty when I made my rounds. Westbury, Whimsy repeated thoughtfully. Our destination, as it happens. He was almost home, and the doors between carriages. Locked tight after Reading, my lord. Night protocol. No one in, and no one out. Bunter returned at this moment with a tall, angular clergyman who possessed the nervous demeanor of a man unaccustomed to violent death. The Reverend Timothy Blackwood of St. Swithin's, Little Chiding, clutched his prayer book as though it might ward off further unpleasantness. Most distressing, he murmured, carefully avoiding the compartment doorway. I was reading my breviary when the commotion began. The railway compartments are quite soundproofed, you understand. I heard nothing from next door. Soundproofed, Whimsy repeated, his pale eyes sharpening. How convenient for murderers. And yet Miss Dane heard furniture being overturned. Rather selective soundproofing, wouldn't you say? The Reverend flushed slightly. Well, that is to say, Whimsy's attention had shifted to the floor near the compartment door. On the carpet, just inside the threshold, was a faint smudge of mud, fresh mud, still damp despite the heated carriage. Curious, he murmured, adjusting his monocle. Our victim's shoes are immaculate, yet someone with muddy feet has been in his compartment. Reverend, I notice your trouser cuffs are rather damp. Been taking the air, have we? Blackwood's grip on his prayer book tightened. I opened the window briefly. For ventilation, the compartments can be rather stuffy. In a driving rainstorm, Whimsy said pleasantly. How very bracing of you. Perkins, I think we shall need that passenger manifest, and perhaps you might check whether any windows in the empty compartments have been disturbed. I have a growing suspicion that our locked carriage is not quite as impregnable as railway regulations suggest. The rain continued its assault on the windows, and in the gaslight's flickering glow, the impossible crime began to reveal its first tantalizing contradictions. Perkins departed with visible reluctance, clutching his notebook as though it contained the secrets of railway salvation. Whimsy remained in the corridor, his pale eyes moving between Miss Dane and the Reverend Blackwood with the methodical attention of a man cataloguing curiosities. Let us establish, for everyone's peace of mind, he said pleasantly, precisely what each of us was doing during the crucial moments. After all, railway timetables are the very soul of civilized existence, and murder should not be permitted to disrupt them unnecessarily. Miss Dane had recovered sufficient composure to speak without trembling. I left my compartment just before the train stopped, perhaps 2 minutes before. I'd been reading since Reading. The guard had only recently passed. I went to the lavatory at the far end of the carriage, and while washing my hands, felt the brakes engage. Then I heard the commotion from compartment C. You encountered no one in the corridor. No one at all. It was completely empty, both going and returning. Whimsy nodded thoughtfully. So you traversed the entire length twice, with ample opportunity to observe any movement. Most illuminating. Reverend? Blackwood started as though jerked from uncomfortable meditation. I remained in my compartment throughout, reading the epistle to the Romans. In the railway compartments are quite soundproofed, you understand. I heard nothing until Miss Dane's cry. Curious selective soundproofing, Whimsy murmured. Yet you mentioned earlier that you opened your window for ventilation. The mud on your trouser cuffs is remarkably fresh. Still damp, in fact. Railway mud is tenacious, but not immortal. Bunter, do you recall the reverend gentleman's trousers bearing their present decorative edging when he boarded? Bunter's impassive gaze rested momentarily on Blackwood's ankles. They did not, my lord. Before the clergyman could protest further, Whimsy had moved to examine compartment D. Bunter, would you investigate the empty compartments, particularly their windows? I'm developing a theory about the permeability of locked railway carriages. while Bunter conducted his examination. Whimsy stationed himself at the corridor window, calculating distances with the precision of a surveyor. "Reverend Blackwood, you mentioned hearing voices from compartment C when the train stopped. 2 voices, you said." "Yes, distinctly. One was the deceased gentleman's, rather agitated. The other was muffled, as though speaking through fabric or from some distance." Bunter returned with news that confirmed Whimsy's suspicions. "My lord, compartment D's window is unlocked and slightly ajar. The exterior handle shows fresh scratches in the paint, and the mechanism has been recently manipulated." "Excellent. So our murderer entered or departed through the window, rather athletic, considering we were traveling at 40 miles per hour. Unless, Perkins, when precisely did we begin reducing speed?" "About 2 miles back, my lord. His signal warnings brought us down to 15 miles per hour before the full stop." 15 miles per hour, Whimsy mused. Still considerable, but not impossible for someone desperate or well-practiced in such maneuvers. Someone who knew this train's schedule intimately, who understood signal protocols and— He was interrupted by a commotion from compartment D. Perkins emerged, dragging a disheveled young man by the collar of a rough tweed jacket. The newcomer was pale, frantic-eyed, and possessed the trapped look of a cornered animal. "Stowaway," Perkins announced triumphantly. "Found him huddled under the seat rugs like a common vagrant. No ticket and shaking like a leaf in a gale." "I wasn't hiding," the young man protested. "I was sleeping. I must have boarded the wrong train somehow." "An understandable confusion," Whimsy drawled, examining the stranger with renewed interest. "Though one usually notices when wedged beneath railway upholstery. Your name?" "Arthur Vane. I'm an artist, or was before." He trailed off, staring at the blood on his sleeve with dawning horror. Whimsy's attention sharpened. "Before what, Mr. Vane? And perhaps you'd explain that rather artistic smear on your cuff." "I cut myself shaving," Vane stammered. "On a moving train, in darkness. Remarkable dexterity." Whimsy had already extracted the wallet from the corpse's pocket. "Perhaps you'd care to explain your proximity to the late Mr. Silas Thorne?" The effect was electric. Vane recoiled against the corridor wall, his face draining of what little color remained. "Thorne? He's dead." "Thoroughly deceased. You knew him." "Knew him." Vane's laugh held no humor. "He was a blood-sucking usurer who drove my father to his grave over a debt of £500. He holds a lien on my mother's cottage. If he's dead, the world is considerably cleaner." A sentiment doubtless shared by many, Whimsy observed. "However, the law takes a dim view of unauthorized sanitation. You followed him from Paddington." "Yes. I wanted to confront him, to make him release the lien. But when I reached his compartment, the door was locked. I knocked, I shouted, no answer. So I went next door to wait, and I must have dozed off." "Locked?" Whimsy raised an eyebrow. Yet Miss Dane found it open. Doors rarely unlock themselves posthumously. "Bunter, perhaps you'd relieve Mr. Vane of that walking stick. I suspect the ferrule might prove instructive." As Perkins led the protesting Vane away, Whimsy remained motionless, and his cigarette glowing in the gaslight. "Bunter," he murmured finally, "I fear this is all rather too convenient. Like a melodrama where the villain enters stage left wearing a placard announcing his guilt. Someone has taken considerable trouble to present us with an obvious solution." The rain continued its assault on the windows, and somewhere in the locked carriage, truth waited to be distinguished from carefully orchestrated deception. The arrival of officialdom came with the grinding of brakes and the hiss of steam as the 9:35 limped into Westbury Junction. Inspector Charles Purvis of the local constabulary boarded with the air of a man who suspected the entire railway system of conspiring against his peace of mind. Behind him came the station master, red-faced and bristling with the accumulated grievances of a man whose schedules had been personally affronted by murder. "Lord Peter Whimsy," Purvis announced, consulting a telegram with reluctant deference. "Scotland Yard suggests I should value your observations, though I confess I'm unaccustomed to aristocratic assistance in police matters. How gratifying to discover one's reputation travels faster than the Great Western Railway," Whimsy replied amiably. "Though I assure you, Inspector, my involvement is entirely accidental. I merely happened to stumble over your corpse and attempted to prevent anyone from treading on the evidence." Purvis examined the body with methodical competence, his square face betraying no emotion as he noted the angle of the neck and the pooled blood. Considerable force required. So young Vane admits to following the victim, bears blood on his sleeve, and harbors an obvious grudge. Seems straightforward enough to me. "Distressingly straightforward," Whimsy agreed, lighting a fresh cigarette with deliberate casualness. "Which is precisely what troubles me. Murder is rarely so obliging as to present itself wrapped in ribbon with a card attached. Tell me, Inspector, does it not strike you as peculiar that a man intent on homicide would conceal himself beneath seat rugs rather than simply departing the scene?" "Panic, my lord. Murderers aren't known for rational behavior after the fact. On the contrary, most successful murderers are excessively rational. It's their victims who tend toward irrationality, which is generally why they become victims." Whimsy gestured toward the telegram, and now secured in an evidence envelope. "Consider the logistics, Inspector. This message was dispatched at 9:15 from Paddington, 20 minutes before our train departed. Arrangements confirmed. Meet as discussed. Urgent." Someone knew Thorne's travel plans with remarkable precision. Purvis frowned, consulting his notebook. Could be any business associate. Could be, but observe this curious detail. Whimsy produced the passenger manifest with a flourish. Thorne's ticket was purchased at Reading this morning, despite his boarding at Paddington. He changed his plans, Inspector. Something, or someone, made him alter his route at the last moment. He was traveling to meet someone specific, someone who knew he'd be on this particular train. While Purvis absorbed this information, Whimsy had returned to compartment C, chenilling to examine the space beneath the seats with Bunter's electric torch. "Ah, what have we here?" The beam illuminated a small object wedged behind the heating pipe. A woman's handkerchief, delicately embroidered with blue flowers and scented faintly with lavender. "Not yours, Miss Dane?" he inquired, producing the handkerchief with tweezers. "Certainly not, Lord Peter. I use plain linen exclusively. And rather too refined for our late friend Mr. Thorne, which suggests a female visitor who perhaps preferred not to be observed." Whimsy's pale eyes moved systematically between the remaining passengers. Yet Miss Dane, who traversed this corridor twice, encountered no one, which presents us with an interesting paradox. Reverend Blackwood had grown increasingly pale during this exchange, felt his hands trembling as they gripped his prayer book. "Inspector," he said suddenly, his voice barely above a whisper, "I fear I have not been entirely forthcoming about my relationship with the deceased." "Indeed." Whimsy's tone carried that particular note of polite interest that those who knew him had learned to dread. "Silas Thorne held the mortgage on our church restoration. The vestry borrowed £5,000 for roof repairs, a considerable sum for a rural parish. When donations fell short," Blackwood's voice trailed off miserably, "he threatened foreclosure," Whimsy supplied gently, "to seize church assets, most inconvenient for a clergyman's reputation. It would have been ruin, complete ruin. The scandal alone would have destroyed my ministry." Purvis scribbled furiously in his notebook. So we have two suspects with clear motives. Vane seeking vengeance for his father, Blackwood facing financial ruin. The case grows clearer by the moment." "Does it?" Whimsy had moved to the window of compartment D, examining the lock mechanism with his magnifying glass. "I find it grows murkier. Consider, Inspector. We have a locked railway carriage, a single corridor, and a timeline that refuses to behave itself. Mr. Vane claims to have been pounding on Thorne's door, yet no one heard this commotion. The Reverend's trousers bear fresh railway mud, suggesting contact with the track below. And we have physical evidence of a female presence that no witness can account for. He straightened, his expression thoughtful. Someone planned this murder with considerable sophistication, Inspector. They knew Thorne's travel arrangements. They understood railway protocols and arranged matters so that obvious suspects would present themselves with convenient motives. But they made one crucial error. They assumed we would accept the obvious solution without examining the impossible details. Purvis looked skeptical. You're suggesting someone else entirely? I'm suggesting that the person who killed Silas Thorne may never have officially boarded this train at all. Someone who could appear and disappear like a conjuring trick, leaving only carefully planted evidence and a collection of convenient suspects. Whimsy's cigarette glowed in the gaslight as he contemplated the rain-streaked window. The question, Inspector, is not who among our passengers had motive to kill Thorne. No, the question is who had the skill to commit murder in a locked railway carriage and vanish without trace. The train sat motionless in the station, its lighted windows reflecting off the wet platform stones. Inside compartment C, Silas Thorne kept his final appointment, while somewhere in the November darkness, his killer waited to see whether careful planning would prove sufficient to outwit the inconvenient curiosity of Lord Peter Whimsy. Inspector Purvis possessed the admirable quality of preferring suspects who could be handcuffed to theories that could not. He regarded Whimsy's metaphysical speculations with the skepticism of a man whose professional success depended upon presenting magistrates with flesh-and-blood criminals rather than philosophical abstractions. "With respect, my lord," he said, not consulting his notebook with the reverence of a man handling scripture. "The law deals in facts. Young Vane follows Thorne, harbors obvious grudges, and is discovered hiding with blood on his sleeve. The Reverend faces financial ruin and admits to deception about his evening's activities. I see no compelling reason to seek murderers who may exist only in theory." "Ah, but Inspector," Whimsy replied, settling himself in the station waiting room with the languid grace of a cat claiming sunshine. "The obvious solution is so often the railway sandwich of deduction, purchased in haste, regretted at leisure. Consider our timeline once more. Miss Dane departed her compartment at 9:50, precisely 2 minutes before the train stopped. She traversed the corridor twice, encountering no one. Yet during this exact interval, as someone entered Thorne's compartment, broke his neck with considerable professional efficiency, and vanished without trace. Bunter had been conducting a methodical examination of the evidence, his impassive features betraying nothing of his discoveries. "My lord," he announced quietly, producing a small object from his waistcoat pocket. "I took the liberty of examining the exterior of the carriage. This was wedged beneath the running board of compartment D. The object was a railway ticket stub. First class, Paddington to Westbury, dated that very evening." Whimsy examined it through his monocle with the attention of a jeweler appraising diamonds. "Most illuminating, Bunter. Thorne's ticket was found in his pocket, which means this belongs to someone else. Someone who traveled with us tonight, but avoided official scrutiny." He held the stub to the gaslight, studying the punch mark with growing interest. "Notice, Inspector, that this wasn't clipped by Guard Perkins. The pattern is wrong. This is a conductor's punch, not a guard's." "Impossible," Purvis protested. "The train had no conductor after reading, only Perkins and the engine crew." "Precisely. Which suggests someone boarded with this ticket but never submitted to proper inspection. Someone familiar enough with railway protocols to know when and how to avoid detection." Whimsy's pale eyes had taken on that particular gleam that those who knew him had learned to associate with uncomfortable revelations. Someone who could appear and disappear like a stage magician, leaving only carefully arranged evidence and a collection of convenient suspects. Miss Dane had been listening to this exchange with growing agitation, her composed facade beginning to crack like poorly fired porcelain. The handkerchief discovery had clearly disturbed her more than she cared to admit, and Whimsy's penetrating analysis seemed to strip away her remaining defenses. "Miss Dane," he said gently, his tone carrying that deceptive kindness that was often more devastating than accusation. "There remains the matter of the embroidered handkerchief found in Thorne's compartment. You recognized it immediately, despite your denials. Your pulse quickened, your breathing altered. Small signs, but unmistakable to one who has made a study of human deception." She stared at him with the trapped expression of a cornered animal, her hands trembling as they gripped her traveling bag. I don't know what you mean." "I think you do." The lavender scent was genuine and fresh, not something carried casually in one's pocket for months. This handkerchief has been recently handled by someone who knew its significance. Whimsy's voice remained gentle, but his eyes were relentless. "Whose handkerchief is it, Miss Dane?" The silence stretched like a taut wire until she could bear it no longer. "It belonged to my sister," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the rain drumming against the windows. "My twin sister, Clara. She was engaged to Silas Thorne 3 years ago." "And the engagement ended unhappily?" "He broke it off when father lost his investments. Clara had no dowry, you see. And Thorne was never a man to let sentiment interfere with profit." Her voice carried the bitter edge of old grief. "It destroyed her. She took her own life 6 months ago." Whimsy absorbed this revelation with the careful attention of a man assembling a complex puzzle. "And you kept the handkerchief as a remembrance?" "Yes. It was among her possessions when we found her." Tears had begun to track down her cheeks, though her voice remained steady. "I wanted to see him tonight. To see the man who killed my sister as surely as if he'd pushed her from a cliff. When the door was ajar, I looked in. I must have dropped it then." "Or," Whimsy suggested with devastating gentleness, "you dropped it when you entered the compartment to check whether he was truly dead. Because you didn't merely look, did you, Miss Dane? You went inside. And perhaps you saw something, or someone, that has kept you silent ever since." Her composure finally shattered completely. "I saw nothing," she cried. "Only the dead man slumped in his seat. There was no one else, I swear it." "A pity," Whimsy murmured, turning to gaze out at the rain-soaked platform where porters moved like ghosts in the gaslight. "Because I suspect the person you're protecting doesn't officially exist, at least not on tonight's passenger manifest." Inspector Purvis had been scribbling furiously throughout this exchange, his practical mind struggling to accommodate the growing complexity of motives and connections. "So we have Miss Dane with a powerful motive for revenge, Vane with his father's debts, Blackwood facing financial ruin. Half of England seems to have wanted Thorne dead." "Indeed, which is precisely why his actual killer chose this particular train, this particular evening. They knew that obvious suspects would present themselves, complete with motives and incriminating evidence. Someone orchestrated this murder with considerable sophistication, Inspector. Someone who understood that the best place to hide a carefully planned crime is among a collection of obvious ones." Whimsy lit a fresh cigarette, his elegant profile sharp against the yellow gaslight. "The question now is whether our phantom passenger left any other traces of their presence. Bunter, I think we shall need to examine the guard's van and the luggage compartments. Someone who could board and depart without official notice would require considerable knowledge of railway operations, or assistance from someone already aboard." The station clock struck midnight, its chimes echoing across the empty platforms. In the waiting room, 3 suspects maintained their separate silences, while in the station master's office, Lord Peter Whimsy contemplated the curious problem of a murder committed by someone who might never have officially existed, except in the memories of the dead and the conscience of the living. The guard's van at Westbury Junction resembled a museum of traveling anxieties, crammed with the accumulated impedimenta of a dozen passengers' journeys. Bunter's systematic search moved with ecclesiastical precision through trunks and hat boxes, while Whimsy observed from his perch atop a crate marked "Fragile, ecclesiastical vestments. "Perkins," Whimsy remarked, adjusting his monocle to examine a leather traveling case wedged behind the mail sacks, "I observe that your van contains one item bearing no identification tag. Rather irregular for a man who prides himself on proper procedures." The guard's face had acquired the mottled complexion of a man discovering that his professional reputation was about to suffer severe damage. "Must have overlooked it in the loading, my lord. Happens sometimes." "Does it indeed?" Whimsy's tone carried that particular note of polite skepticism that those who knew him had learned to dread. "Bunter, would you be so good as to examine this anonymous luggage?" The case yielded its secrets reluctantly. Women's traveling clothes, a dark mourning veil, and then beneath these, a railway timetable extensively annotated in precise handwriting. Red ink circled specific entries. Westbury Junction, signal delay expected, speed reduction 2 miles before station. "Most illuminating," Whimsy murmured, studying the annotations. Someone knew this train would slow at precisely the location where Thorn met his end. "Rather suggests premeditation, wouldn't you say, Inspector?" Purvis examined the evidence with growing comprehension. "But how could anyone predict signal delays?" "Perhaps," Whimsy suggested gently, "because they arranged them. Perkins, I notice your uniform jacket is missing its 3rd button. The thread appears freshly broken, as though torn off during some sort of struggle." Perkins' hand flew instinctively to his jacket, his face draining of color. "Caught it on luggage, my lord. Happens all the time. Or perhaps during a conversation with Silas Thorne about stopping this train in a convenient location." Whimsy's pale eyes had taken on that relentless quality that indicated uncomfortable truths were about to surface. "You see, Inspector, I suspect our guard received certain financial inducements to create the precise conditions necessary for murder." The silence stretched until Perkins could bear it no longer. "He paid me £50, he burst out desperately. "Said he needed to meet someone private-like, away from station crowds. My wife needs an operation. I couldn't refuse." "Ah," Whimsy said softly. "So Thorne arranged his own isolated meeting, but the person he expected wasn't the business associate he anticipated. So someone used his own arrangements against him." He lifted a small notebook from the case, Thorne's private accounts, meticulously recording his victim's financial destruction. One entry stood out starkly. "Clara Dane. Engagement terminated. Full repayment demanded. Current status, deceased." "Inspector," Whimsy continued, his voice carrying the weight of revelation, "we're dealing with someone who planned this murder with extraordinary precision. They knew Thorne's habits, his schedule, his willingness to arrange clandestine meetings. They used his own greed to create the perfect conditions for revenge." Miss Dane's sharp intake of breath confirmed what Whimsy had already deduced. "The handkerchief in his compartment belonged to your sister Clara, didn't it, Miss Dane? Someone wanted us to know exactly why Silas Thorne deserved to die." Purvis scribbled furiously in his notebook. "So we have the method. Perkins stopped the train. But who actually killed him?" "Someone who could move through a locked railway carriage like a ghost," Whimsy replied, his cigarette glowing in the gaslight. "Someone who understood that the best alibi is to ensure everyone else appears guilty. But I think, Inspector, our phantom passenger left one crucial piece of evidence, something that will reveal not just who they are, but how they accomplished the impossible." The station clock struck 1, its chimes echoing across the rain-soaked platforms where truth waited to be illuminated in the cold November dawn. The grey light of dawn crept across Westbury Junction with the reluctant persistence of unwelcome truth, casting long shadows through the waiting room where the night's interrogations had left their mark on both suspects and investigators alike. Inspector Purvis bore the haggard expression of a man whose certainties had been systematically dismantled, while the assembled passengers maintained their separate silences with the wary attention of creatures sensing approaching revelation. Whimsy had spent the intervening hours in that peculiar state of motionless concentration that those who knew him recognized as the prelude to uncomfortable discoveries. Now, as the station clock struck 6, he stirred with the languid grace of a cat emerging from contemplation. "Inspector," he announced, producing a sheet of paper covered with precise notations. "I believe the time has come to submit our various theories to the merciless discipline of chronology. Murder may be an art, but it remains subject to the tyranny of time and the inconvenient persistence of physical evidence. The reconstruction of events." He had commandeered the station master's desk, transforming it into a makeshift laboratory of deduction. A detailed diagram of the railway carriage lay before him, marked with times and movements in his precise handwriting. "Let us begin with what we know beyond dispute," Whimsy continued, his monocle catching the gaslight as he consulted his notes. "The 9:35 from Paddington departed on schedule. Guard Perkins checked tickets after reading and locked the carriage doors according to night protocol. At 9:50, Miss Dane left compartment A for the lavatory. At 9:51, the first caution signal brought our speed down to 15 miles per hour. At 9:54, we stopped completely at this very station." Miss Dane shifted uncomfortably in her chair, her traveling coat pulled tight against the morning chill. "I've told you everything I remember, Lord Peter. I saw nothing, heard only that terrible sound from compartment C." But you heard something very specific, didn't you? You described it as furniture being overturned, a loud bang followed by silence. Yet when we examined Thorne's compartment, nothing was disturbed save the man himself." Whimsy's pale eyes had taken on that particular intensity that indicated uncomfortable truths were approaching. "Which suggests that what you heard was not the murder itself, but something else entirely. The matter of timing." Bunter had been conducting his own methodical examination of the evidence, his impassive features revealing nothing of his discoveries. Now he stepped forward with the precision of a man delivering a carefully prepared report. "My lord," he said quietly, "I have re-examined the deceased's watch. It stopped at 9:47, presumably when the mechanism was damaged during the struggle. However, the medical evidence suggests rigor mortis had not yet begun when the body was discovered, indicating death occurred within the hour preceding." 9:47, Whimsy repeated thoughtfully. "So some 7 minutes before Miss Dane heard her furniture overturning. Which presents us with a fascinating paradox. Sounds of violence occurring after the victim was already dead." Reverend Blackwood had grown increasingly pale during this exchange, his hands trembling as they gripped his prayer book. The fresh mud on his trouser cuffs had dried now, but the evidence of his nocturnal activities remained clearly visible. "There's something else," Whimsy continued, producing a small device from his coat pocket, a portable gramophone of the sort favored by traveling salesmen. Bunter discovered this hidden beneath the seat cushions in compartment B. Most interesting reading material accompanies it. He held up a wax cylinder, its label written in the same precise hand as the annotated railway timetable. A recording of voices, one agitated, one muffled, precisely what our reverend friend claimed to have heard from the adjoining compartment. Except, of course, he didn't hear it. He created it. The unraveling of deception. The silence that followed was broken only by the distant whistle of the morning express and the steady tick of the station clock. Blackwood's composure finally cracked completely, his face crumpling like poorly fired pottery. "The children," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the rain drumming against the windows. "The orphanage children were starving. The parish funds were insufficient. I intended to replace every penny from the restoration money, but Thorne discovered the discrepancy before I could make good the deficit. And he used this knowledge to blackmail you into silence, while he systematically plundered the church assets," Whimsy supplied gently. "Most ingenious of him, forcing you to be complicit in your own destruction." Inspector Purvis had been scribbling furiously in his notebook, his practical mind struggling to accommodate the psychological complexity of the crime. So Blackwood killed Thorne to prevent exposure of the embezzlement. More than that, Inspector. He killed him to prevent the destruction of everything he held sacred. His ministry, his reputation, his ability to care for those orphaned children who depended upon him. Whimsy's voice carried a note of something approaching sympathy. This was not mere self-preservation. See, this was a man choosing between two forms of damnation and selecting what he perceived as the lesser evil. The method revealed. Whimsy moved to the window of the waiting room, gazing out at the rain-soaked platforms where the truth had finally emerged into the grey dawn light. The method itself was elegantly simple, if morally complex. Blackwood arranged to meet Thorne in compartment C during the scheduled signal delay, a delay he had arranged through guard Perkins, who was desperate for the £50 Thorne offered for the service. But how did he manage the locked door? Purvis demanded. The mechanism was secure from the inside. Railway locks, Inspector, are designed for honest travellers, not determined clergymen with mechanical knowledge and a piece of communion wire. Whimsy demonstrated with a length of thin metal, threading it through the latch mechanism with practiced ease. A simple matter of leverage and timing. Blackwood entered through the unlocked door at 9:45 when Thorne was expecting his mysterious business associate, M.S. Instead, he found his blackmailer. The confrontation had been brief and decisive. Thorne, seated and unsuspecting, had no opportunity to defend himself against the clergyman's desperate strength. The neck was broken with the efficiency of a man who had once served as a military chaplain and understood the mechanics of sudden death. The gramophone recording was activated as Blackwood departed, creating the illusion that the murder occurred later, when he was safely established in his own compartment with an unshakable alibi. Whimsy's cigarette glowed in the morning light. Miss Dane's handkerchief was planted to direct suspicion toward the grieving sister, while Arthur Vane's presence provided an additional scapegoat with obvious motive. The final accounting. As Inspector Purvis moved forward with his handcuffs, Reverend Blackwood made no attempt to resist. His shoulders sagged with the weight of confession, and when he spoke, his voice carried the hollow tone of a man who had lost everything he had sought to preserve. "I told myself it was God's justice," he said quietly, "that Thorne's death would save more lives than it cost. But I know now that I was merely a murderer, seeking divine sanction for earthly revenge." Whimsy watched the arrest with the melancholy expression of a man who had solved a puzzle only to discover that the solution brought no satisfaction. "The tragedy, Inspector, now is not that a wicked man died, but that a good man was driven to wickedness by circumstances beyond his control. Silas Thorne destroyed lives with ledger entries and legal documents. Blackwood destroyed himself with his own conscience." As the morning express pulled into the station with a great hissing of steam and grinding of brakes, Lord Peter Whimsy gathered his belongings with the weary precision of a man whose weekend in the country had been thoroughly disrupted by the inconvenient persistence of human nature. "Come, Bunter," he said finally, adjusting his coat against the morning chill. "I believe we shall take the next train to London. I find myself in need of civilized surroundings and a proper breakfast. Rural murders, I've discovered, are remarkably similar to rural cooking. They may satisfy immediate needs, but they leave one longing for something more refined." The case was closed, justice had been served, but as they departed Westbury Junction, Whimsy could not shake the feeling that in this particular instance, the distinction between victim and villain had proven disturbingly arbitrary. The grey dawn light filtering through the station windows cast long shadows across the waiting room, where Inspector Purvis was in the act of securing the handcuffs around Reverend Blackwood's wrists. The clergyman's confession had brought a sense of closure to the night's events, yet Lord Peter Whimsy remained motionless by the window, his elegant profile sharp against the morning light, cigarette smoke curling upward like incense from some private altar of contemplation. "Inspector," he said suddenly, his voice cutting through the subdued murmur of official proceedings with the precision of a blade. "I fear we are about to commit that most cardinal of investigative sins, accepting a convenient solution without subjecting it to the merciless discipline of physical fact." Purvis paused, his hands still gripping the handcuffs, his square face betraying the bewilderment of a man whose tidy conclusion was being systematically dismantled. "But the confession, my lord, the gramophone, the motive, the evidence, all perfectly compelling," Whimsy agreed, turning from the window with that deceptive languor that masked considerable tension. "And therein lies our difficulty. Murder is rarely so obliging as to present itself wrapped in ribbon with a card attached. Bunter, cast your mind back to our initial examination of compartment C. Use the door. How precisely was it secured?" Bunter's impassive features revealed nothing of his thoughts, but his response carried the precision of a man who had made a career of observing crucial details. "The key was in the lock, my lord, on the interior side, turned to the horizontal position indicating full engagement of the mechanism." "Precisely." Whimsy's pale eyes had taken on that particular gleam that those who knew him had learned to associate with uncomfortable revelations. "And as any locksmith, or indeed any child who has experimented with nursery door latches, can testify, when a key occupies the lock barrel from the interior, external manipulation becomes physically impossible. No amount of communion wire or clerical ingenuity could overcome the basic mechanics of the mechanism. The impossibility revealed. The silence that followed was broken only by the distant whistle of the morning express and Blackwood's sharp intake of breath. The clergyman stared at Whimsy with the expression of a man watching his carefully constructed sacrifice crumble into meaninglessness. "You see, Inspector," Whimsy continued, lighting a fresh cigarette with hands that were perfectly steady, "the Reverend has confessed to performing a miracle, opening a locked door without benefit of key or supernatural intervention. While his profession deals extensively in miracles, the laws of physics prove regrettably inflexible in matters of criminal investigation." Purvis removed the handcuffs with the mechanical movements of a man whose certainties had been thoroughly shattered. "Then who?" "Someone with considerably more mechanical skill than our good Reverend," Whimsy replied, his attention shifting to Arthur Vane, who had been watching these proceedings with the trapped expression of a cornered animal. "Someone who understood railway locks, signal protocols, and the psychology of misdirection. Someone who arranged matters so that obvious suspects would present themselves with convenient motives." Blackwood had collapsed onto the nearest bench, his face buried in his hands, shoulders shaking with what might have been relief or despair. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the hollow tone of a man whose protective instincts had overridden his rational mind. "I couldn't let you take him," he whispered, the words barely audible above the rain drumming against the windows. "When I saw him board at Reading, saw the hatred in his eyes when Thorne's name was mentioned, and then found Thorne dead, I assumed the worst. I thought he had finally done what I had seen him contemplating for months." "Him?" Purvis demanded, his gaze shifting between Blackwood and the pale young man who bore such a striking resemblance to the clergyman's angular features. "The hidden connection." "Arthur Vane is my son, Inspector," Blackwood said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of a 20-year secret. "The result of a youthful indiscretion before I took my vows. I've watched him from afar. I helped his mother when I could, tried to guide his path without revealing our connection. When Thorne's usury drove his father to suicide and threatened his mother's cottage, I saw the rage building in him. I feared he had inherited more than my features." Vane stared at the clergyman with dawning comprehension, his artistic temperament struggling to process this revelation. "You're my... But Mother never said... She promised to keep our secret. I was already committed to the church, you see. A scandal would have destroyed both our futures." Blackwood's voice strengthened slightly. "But I have watched over you both, ensured your mother received anonymous donations, arranged for your art school scholarship through intermediaries. When I saw you on this train, you pursuing Thorne with murder in your eyes. I wanted to confront him, not kill him, Vane protested. Though God knows I've dreamed of it often enough, but when I reached his compartment, it was locked tight. I pounded on the door, shouted through the keyhole. Nothing. So I went to the empty compartment to wait, and I must have fallen asleep. The true timeline. Whimsy had been examining the evidence with renewed attention, his analytical mind reassembling the timeline with the precision of a clockmaker adjusting delicate mechanisms. The shaving cut on your sleeve is genuine. Bunter found the bloodied razor and towel in the lavatory bin. You lack the temperament for premeditated murder, Mr. Vane. No, we are dealing with someone considerably more sophisticated. He produced the yellow telegram, studying the signature with his magnifying glass. MS. We assume this referred to a business associate, but observe the time stamp. Dispatched from Paddington at 9:15, 20 minutes before our departure. Yet the anonymous ticket stub Bunter discovered bears the punch mark of a connecting line, time-stamped 8:45. Our killer didn't board at Paddington with the rest of us. They transferred from another service, someone who understood railway operations intimately. Inspector Purvis scribbled furiously in his notebook, his practical mind struggling to accommodate the growing complexity of the case. But if not Blackwood and not young Vane, then who? Miss Dane lacks the physical strength, and we've accounted for everyone else aboard. Have we? Whimsy's smile carried no warmth. We've accounted for everyone on the passenger manifest, but railway employees move between carriages as part of their duties. Someone with legitimate access, someone who could appear and disappear without arousing suspicion, someone who understood signal protocols and could arrange the precise conditions necessary for murder. The mechanical solution. He moved to the door of compartment C, examining the lock mechanism with his pocket liners. The key was turned from inside after the murder, creating the illusion of suicide or impossible crime. But observe these minute scratches around the keyhole, fresh marks suggesting the use of precision tools. Someone with locksmith skills and railway keys could secure the door from outside, and then manipulate the internal mechanism to create our locked room mystery. Bunter had been conducting his own examination of the evidence, his methodical approach yielding results that confirmed Whimsy's deductions. My lord, I have re-examined the guard's van thoroughly. Among the unclaimed luggage is a tool case containing railway maintenance equipment, including master keys and lock-picking implements. The case bears the initials MS and a Southern Railway employee badge. MS, Whimsy repeated thoughtfully. Not a business associate, but a railway employee with both motive and opportunity. Someone who knew Thorne's travel habits, who could arrange signal delays and manipulate evidence with professional expertise. The morning express was pulling into the station now, and its arrival announced by the great hissing of steam and grinding of brakes. Passengers began emerging onto the platform, and among them, Whimsy spotted a figure in railway uniform, moving with purposeful haste toward the exit. "Inspector," he said quietly, his voice carrying that note of certainty that indicated the hunt was approaching its conclusion, "I believe our phantom passenger has decided to depart. We must move quickly if we are to prevent a carefully planned murder from becoming a perfect crime." As Purvis gathered his men for the pursuit, Whimsy remained motionless for a moment longer, his pale eyes fixed on the retreating figure with the intensity of a man who had finally glimpsed truth beneath the carefully constructed layers of deception. "The problem with elaborate schemes," he murmured to Bunter, "is that they require their architects to remain nearby long enough to ensure their success. Our killer has stayed too long at the scene, and now must face the consequences of their own thoroughness." The grey dawn light was strengthening now, casting sharp shadows across the platform where justice waited to be served with the precision of a railway timetable, inexorable, methodical, and utterly without mercy for those who had mistaken careful planning for perfect execution. The platform at Westbury Junction had acquired the frenzied animation of a stage in the final act of a melodrama, with porters dashing about like extras who had suddenly discovered their importance to the plot. Inspector Purvis bellowed orders with the authority of a man whose patience had been systematically eroded by impossible crimes and inconvenient revelations, and while the early morning passengers found themselves swept into an impromptu pageant of justice delayed but not denied. "Kindly observe," murmured Whimsy, his hand light on Purvis's arm as his pale eyes tracked a figure moving with suspicious purpose through the crowd. The gentleman in station master's uniform who has suddenly developed an urgent need to inspect the coal yard. Most irregular behavior for a man whose primary concern should be the punctual departure of the morning express. The figure in question, Mr. Matthew Stone, whose brass nameplate had identified him throughout the night as the efficient administrator of Westbury Junction, was moving with the careful haste of a man who hoped to appear busy while actually departing. His route led not toward the station offices where duty called, but toward the maintenance yards where escape beckoned. "Stone," Purvis called sharply. "A moment, if you please." The chase through industrial wasteland. The effect was electric. Stone's measured pace transformed instantly into headlong flight, and he plunged into the coal yard behind the station with the desperate energy of a man whose carefully constructed plans had collapsed into chaos. The yard was one of those blackened wildernesses of slag, cinders, and abandoned machinery that railway companies cultivate as monuments to the industrial sublime. All soot-stained brick and rusted metal under the grey morning sky. Constable Mitchell, who had been nursing tepid tea with the philosophical resignation of a man whose chief ambition was invisibility, abandoned his beverage and launched himself into pursuit. Stone, burdened with regulation boots and the accumulated guilt of premeditated murder, was already negotiating a stack of coal sacks with the graceless agility of a man unaccustomed to athletic endeavors. "Head him off at the ash pit, Mitchell," Purvis shouted, plunging after the fleeing figure with the grim determination of a man whose case had finally acquired a satisfactory villain. Whimsy, who had no intention of subjecting his evening clothes to industrial contamination, took a more circuitous route between two freight wagons. His pale eyes calculated angles and distances with the precision of a billiards player contemplating a complex shot, while Bunter moved with that deceptive swiftness that had once made him invaluable to His Majesty's forces in less civilized corners of the Empire. The inevitable conclusion. Stone reached the low brick wall bounding the yard and hesitated for one fatal moment, calculating height, distance, and the probable consequences of continued resistance. It was a hesitation that betrayed both his amateur status and his fundamental lack of criminal imagination. Bunter's intervention was both neat and decisive. A perfectly timed grasp at the fleeing man's ankle sent Stone tumbling into the cinders, with Constable Mitchell collapsing triumphantly upon his legs, their combined impact raising a small cloud of coal dust that settled over the scene like theatrical smoke. "Get off me!" Stone snarled, struggling with the futile energy of a trapped animal. His cap had fallen away, revealing a long, narrow face marked by the accumulated grievances of a lifetime spent in subordinate positions, so watching others prosper while he punched tickets and checked timetables. "Now then, Mr. Stone," Purvis said grimly, hauling him upright with the satisfaction of a man whose patience had been vindicated by results, "perhaps you'd care to explain your sudden aversion to official conversation." The unraveling of deception. Back in the station master's office, with Stone secured between two constables and the morning light streaming through windows that revealed every detail of the night's evidence, Whimsy arranged the facts with the methodical precision of a curator displaying rare artifacts. "The beauty of your scheme, Stone," he began, lighting a cigarette with steady hands while his pale eyes remained fixed on the prisoner, lay in its elegant use of railway protocols and administrative authority. So you possessed all the tools necessary for murder, master keys, signal controls, and the invisible authority of uniform that renders one effectively transparent to casual observation. Stone's jaw clenched, but he remained silent, his eyes fixed on some point beyond the window where the morning express thundered past in a storm of steam and mechanical precision. The telegram signed MS was dispatched by you, naturally, Whimsy continued, producing the yellow paper with a flourish. Matthew Stone, not a business associate, but a family connection. Thorne was your cousin, wasn't he? The successful cousin who had somehow acquired what you considered rightfully yours. Half-brothers, Stone said finally, his voice carrying the bitter edge of old grievances. Same father, different mothers. He got the education, the connections, you the inheritance. I got this uniform in 40 years of watching trains pass while he lived like a lord on money that should have been mine. The technical reconstruction. Whimsy nodded with the satisfaction of a man whose deductions had been confirmed by confession. You knew his travel habits because you had observed them for years, the periodic journeys to Westbury, the preference for private meetings during signal delays. You sent the telegram, knowing he would assume it referred to some business opportunity, then arranged the signal delay using your authority as station master. He moved to the window, gazing out at the tracks where the crime had been accomplished with such mechanical precision. When the train stopped at your predetermined location, you simply walked out along the permanent way, a distance of perhaps half a mile, and boarded through the rear carriage using your master keys. Railway employees have legitimate access to all carriages, after all. The murder itself was accomplished during those few minutes of confusion while passengers adjusted to the unexpected stop. You entered Thorne's compartment, killed him with the efficiency of a man who understood anatomy. I suspect your wartime service provided that education, then secured the door from outside using your specialized tools to manipulate the internal lock mechanism. Bunter produced a small device from the evidence collection, a railway maintenance tool designed for accessing locked compartments in emergencies. The scratches around the keyhole match this implement precisely, my lord. And the timing mechanism shows recent use. The psychological dimension. But the truly ingenious aspect, Whimsy continued, his tone carrying that note of reluctant admiration he reserved for well-executed crimes, was your creation of multiple suspects with obvious motives. You planted Miss Dane's sister's handkerchief, knowing it would direct suspicion toward the grieving family. You relied on Young Vane's known hatred and Reverend Blackwood's financial desperation to cloud the investigation with psychological complexity. Miss Dane, who had been listening with horrified fascination, spoke for the first time since her interrogation. You used Clara's memory. You desecrated her grief for your convenience. Stone's laugh held no humor. Your sister was already dead because of him. At least her memory served some useful purpose. Thorne destroyed lives as casually as other men swat flies. Your sister, Vane's father, dozens of others. Someone had to stop him. And so you appointed yourself judge, jury, and executioner, Whimsy observed quietly. Using the very railway system you had served faithfully for decades as your instrument of justice. There is a certain poetic symmetry to it, though the law takes a dim view of unauthorized poetry. The final accounting inspector Purvis stepped forward with his handcuffs, their metallic click echoing in the quiet office like the closing of a book. Matthew Stone, I arrest you for the murder of Silas Thorne. You are not obliged to say anything, but anything you do say will be taken down and may be used in evidence. Stone submitted to the restraints with the mechanical compliance of a man whose capacity for resistance had been thoroughly exhausted. As they prepared to lead him away, he turned once more to Whimsy, his expression carrying a question that had haunted him through the long night. He was a cancer on the world. Surely that counts for something. Perhaps, Whimsy replied with that devastating gentleness he reserved for fallen adversaries. But the law distinguishes between private justice and public murder, just as it distinguishes between personal grievance and legal remedy. You chose the wrong railway line, Stone. This one leads only to the dock, and the dock leads only to the gallows. Epilogue in grey dawn. As the morning light strengthened over Westbury Junction, where the assembled company dispersed with the awkward relief of people who had shared an intimacy they had never sought. Reverend Blackwood approached his newly discovered son with tentative hope, while Miss Dane clutched her sister's handkerchief with the expression of someone whose grief had found unexpected validation. "Bunter," Whimsy said finally, adjusting his coat against the morning chill. "I find myself with a sudden desire for London and civilized surroundings. The country air has proved altogether too stimulating for my constitution. Do ensure our next journey involves a railway line with a less creative approach to timetabling." "Very good, my lord. The 10:15 to Paddington departs in 20 minutes. Shall I reserve a compartment?" "Do. And Bunter, ensure it has locks that work exclusively from the inside, till I've had quite enough of impossible crimes and railway justice for one weekend." The case of the locked railway carriage was closed, leaving behind only the echo of wheels on rails and the memory of a night when logic had triumphed over the chaotic passions of the human heart, though at a cost that would haunt the survivors long after the last whistle had faded into silence. The 10:15 from Westbury to Paddington departed with the punctual indifference of a machine that had witnessed countless human dramas and remained supremely uninterested in their outcomes. Lord Peter Whimsy settled into his first-class compartment with the relief of a man who had spent too many hours contemplating the darker aspects of human nature and longed for the restorative qualities of superficiality. "Bunter," he observed, lighting a cigarette as the grey countryside began its retreat past the rain-streaked windows, "I find myself reflecting upon the curious economics of revenge. Stone sacrificed 40 years of blameless service for approximately 7 minutes of violence, which strikes me as remarkably poor value for the investment." "Indeed, my lord, though one suspects the accounting was conducted in currencies other than temporal." The compartment door opened to admit Inspector Purvis, who settled onto the opposite seat with a sigh that suggested his bones had acquired several decades of additional age since the previous evening. "Thought you'd want to know," he said, consulting his notebook with automatic precision. "Young Vane and his father, the Reverend, are attempting some sort of reconciliation. Miss Dane has agreed to testify, though she's returning to London on the afternoon train. Says she needs considerable distance between herself and railway travel." And Stone? Confessed everything. He'd been planning this for months, studying Thorne's habits, arranging the signal protocols, practicing lock manipulation during night shifts. Thoroughness in all things, apparently. A virtue in station masters and murderers alike, Whimsy murmured, though one wishes he had applied such dedication to less terminal pursuits. After Purvis departed, Whimsy remained motionless for some time, his pale eyes fixed on the passing landscape while his mind contemplated the moral complexities the case had revealed. The wet fields slid past in shades of grey and brown, each mile carrying them further from the scene of carefully orchestrated vengeance. "You know, Bunter," he said finally, "the truly disturbing aspect of this affair is not that Stone committed murder, but that he had such excellent reasons for doing so. Thorne was indeed a cancer on the world, a legal predator who destroyed lives with contracts and compound interest. One almost sympathizes with Stone's desire to excise him from existence. But sympathy, my lord, is distinct from approval." "Precisely. The moment we permit personal justice to supersede legal process, we descend into chaos, however righteous our individual causes might appear." Whimsy's expression carried that note of melancholy those who knew him recognized as genuine emotion beneath the aristocratic facade. "Stone will hang because he was clumsy enough to use steel and cinders instead of ledgers and mortgages. Thorne ruined lives by compound interest, and one dies on the gallows, the other in bed. Yet I fancy Providence will not find the distinction quite as clear as the law books do." The suburbs of London began appearing through the morning mist, their brick monotony a welcome contrast to the psychological complexities of the countryside. As the train pulled into Paddington Station, Whimsy gathered his belongings and prepared to descend into the familiar chaos of urban anonymity. Come along, Bunter. Civilization awaits, and I find myself remarkably eager to embrace its shallow comforts. After all, we are merely passengers on a train we cannot control, traveling toward destinations we did not choose. He paused, quoting softly. Our deeds still travel with us from afar, and what we have been makes us what we are. The case was closed, but the questions it raised would linger long after the last whistle faded into London's indifferent embrace.